Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, or your organization, and what you're passionate about, and we'll go right into it.
Sure. I'm Bernard Moon. I'm a co-founder of SparkLabs group. It's a network of startup accelerators and venture capital funds. We currently have 9 globally, primarily in Asia, and we have 3 traditional venture capital funds. We're a relatively young firm. We launched in 2013, and now we've invested in over 300 startups across 6 continents.
Wow, that's a pretty big number. What drove you into the business?
Well, it was one of my co-founders. I'm sorry, there's like a weird lighting here. One of my co-founders, Hanju, it was in spring of 2012. He built up a hosting business in Chicago, but he was going back and forth from Chicago to Seoul. And he thought it was a great timing to start sort of a Y Combinator of South Korea. Even though Korea already had, like, I would say 20 accelerators at that time, so it was already competitive. But the positioning was really helping Korean startups go global. So, pitched the idea. We got our other co-founder, Jimmy, involved. And then we launched SparkLabs from there. And it was really already, it was things that we were already doing. I mean, Jimmy and I, we joke around that, since our first startup in our late 20s, we were already, giving free advice to entrepreneurs, like other entrepreneurs on, our war stories and what not to do and our mistakes. So that's how we still feel even 8 years later, like venture capital. It's just sort of telling our own stories, giving them advice. We did it freely anyways for like 15 years. We're just adding a check to it, whether it's 100,000 from our accelerator or 1 or 2 million from one of our funds. So
Awesome. And do you focus on a specific kind of startup, or do you pretty much take all comers?
Yeah, no, it's a generalist fund. I mean, we have certain accelerators that focus on a vertical, like we have an ag tech, food tech accelerator in Australia. We are just launching a clean energy accelerator in Singapore. But overall, we are a generalist firm. We look at anything besides pharma, because we're not a large.
Too complicated, too much regulation? Is that why?
No, it's just not a large fund. So for seed and Series A, we don't, because sometimes you need like $30 million, like Series A to like, prove out a drug or something. So we're just not meant for that space.
So how do you find your candidates? I mean, do they come to you, or do you go out there? I mean, I'm assuming that, as a VC, you probably get, or as an accelerator, you probably get inundated by tons of startups trying to come to you and go, hey, can you help me out?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we actually had to think about when we launched the accelerator, and then especially more the fund, is that, you do need that built-in network first, right? So us and then the whole team, the core partners, we figured we had good relations with a lot of the top firms and also entrepreneurial sort of clusters throughout the globe. And then the accelerator was, I would say, a little more hard work. It didn't come as like naturally. I mean, some of it does come naturally from our own network, but the accelerator definitely, when we launched, we had to convince, entrepreneurs to apply, right? Because why would they join us? And at that time we were investing, let's say, like, I forgot, like 50,000 for 6%, like similar to like YC in the early days. Why should they give up 6% for that 50K to us? And then we had to really prove ourselves. But eventually, I would say after the first year, we showed that we actually do add value. And then our graduates, slowly became our best evangelists. So there was definitely a lot of sort of earned trust especially on the accelerator side. So
what kind of services would you provide as an accelerator?
We're not that heavily program focused. That's sort of similar, I guess, to Y Combinator and some of the others. I mean, the companies, they just meet once a week for like an hour and a half. We focus more on direct mentorship, whether it's us or from our stable of mentors, providing office hours. And then not really services, but just, where we focus our guidance and mentorship on, right? Because it depends on the stage. Even early on, we had this range of companies that even the first batch was like bootstrap to companies that raised 500,000 to a company that already raised 3 million. Right. So we continue to have this range of, and we want the balance in each batch of bootstrap to companies now that have raised maybe 5-10 million. Right. So we just focus on what we think, and the founders obviously think they need to focus on for that 4 or 6 months. And then we, set sort of KPIs and goals, for that 4 months, but also even the year. So
Cool. So what do you say was the most surprising thing that you learned doing this?
I'm not sure if it was that surprising, but just some like, cultural nuances, right? Like early on when we would, part of our success is we were able to recruit very sort of senior level or successful either entrepreneurs or execs as mentors. And then when we would match them with these entrepreneurs in South Korea, they would be less aggressive, I would say, right? So I think you see that here in Silicon Valley, especially if it's certain type of engineering CEOs or founders, right? They're not as aggressive as like your typical, obviously, business guy or sales guy, right?
Yep.
So I call it a double whammy in some Asian cultures, like Korea, where you get an engineering CEO, and then they're a little more passive because they're being too polite or too sort of not as aggressive. So we'd have to almost coach them and say, hey,
I thought South Korea had a really hard driving culture. I mean, I'm actually kind of surprised by that.
well, it depends. Yeah, of course, if it's like Samsung, again, it's the personality and culture of even within each company, right? Like Samsung is known for recruiting, and they do attract very hard charging people. They work like 24/7. But then you get a general, it's a generalization, but let's say you look at LG, they're known as the nice guys, right? A little less aggressive, I think typical stereotyping, but I would say less aggressive,
Right.
more polite sort of Asian culture, I would say, right? So you get that with some of our founders, not all, but some of them, they'd be like too polite, like, oh, these guys are too busy. I don't want to bother them. I asked them once, I'm like, no, they are busy. So that's why you have to bother them 2-3 times, until they set up a meeting with you. And they did willingly volunteer their time to help you
Right.
out. So you really have to follow through, right? It's not their
Right.
job to follow through. It's your job to follow through and then gain their trust afterwards. So
Well, it
we would have
sounds
to, oh, go ahead.
feels like you're doing a lot of like cultural education too, right? It's like this is how this culture works. This is how this culture works. In addition to the money mentoring stuff.
Yes, we would not just even with our founders and entrepreneurs in South Korea, but even the mentors we got locally, right? Because as you know, since you're here, right? The secret sauce of obviously Silicon Valley is this paid forward culture, right?
Mhm.
And there really wasn't that. The unicorns from the 90s in South Korea, or people that cashed out very well, they didn't have this mentality of sort of paying it forward or helping out new entrepreneurs, right? They're a little more to themselves. I mean, some were active in helping out the ecosystem, but we basically had to drag some of our peers into this, right? And say, hey, Korea obviously has world-class engineering talent. They also have good design talent, et cetera, but it really needs this paid for culture to cultivate the ecosystem further. I mean, there was already segments of the ecosystem already doing it, but we thought, everyone needs to get involved, right? It's sort of similar, even, as like, I used to work in LA. LA is like night and day between Silicon Valley
Totally
and
different. Totally
yeah,
different.
totally different. It's like a guard your contact Rolodex culture, right? So, even LA, I think, needs to, learn that aspect of Silicon Valley. So.
Yeah. Well, we're a very different place. So you find that so many people were saying that Silicon Valley is like passe. We're done, right? All the rest of the world is now going to take over. But I still think the magic is here. I mean, do you see that? Do you see something like that happening where other areas might be surpassing us in some way?
No, I think our thesis is that the world would become flatter, and obviously other ecosystems would develop and learn. Um, but to say that's obviously it's just whatever media sound bites or people trying to get headlines. I think it'll be far off. I mean, if there's any possibility of Silicon Valley being displaced, it'll probably be like 20, 30 years from now, right? It's still the leader, even though when we started, maybe there were like 10, 15, maybe there was like 10 countries 8 years ago that also had unicorns. It's grown to, I think, like 30 or 40, depending on what study. So this knowledge and culture sharing has obviously been distributed throughout the world, but Silicon Valley is still will be the clear leader for a while.
Yeah. So how do you actually operate? Do you bring them here, or do they stay in South Korea, or how does that work?
So all of our accelerators, if they're, in their home city, right, they're focused on, unless it's a vertical, they're focused on attracting entrepreneurs from that market, right? So for Seoul or SparkLabs Korea, we focus on Korean entrepreneurs, but surprisingly about 15, 20% of the companies that have gone through the program have been outside of Korea. Like we get like applicants from like 30 different countries each time, just because they might be just interested in being part of a SparkLabs program, or they're looking for Korea as a gateway, into Asia. And then we don't bring them to Silicon Valley or elsewhere. We focus on for them to be in that market. And if they're a foreign startup, we just ask them actually to go to the first session in Seoul and then the demo day. Right. And most of the mentoring, even though more than half the mentors are actually in Silicon Valley, since 2013, we've had this, we actually did mentoring through Zoom and video conference since the beginning.
So you've been doing this stuff for a while through remote means. You haven't this is not a new thing to you.
Yeah, it's not. So it's interesting because we were already doing it with all of our accelerators. The majority of the mentoring was already through video or phone. But it doesn't mean I'm not going through Zoom fatigue. I am still.
I think we all are.
Yeah.
So what kind of like if somebody was coming to you to want to get into your accelerator, like what is the criteria that you use to pick something? I mean, does it have to be world changing? Does it have to be a unicorn? I mean, can it be a small thing? I mean, what kind of criteria do you use? Because I think a lot of startups out there are thinking, oh, that sounds really cool. I'd love to get into something like that. But like what do they need to be doing to qualify for something like you?
Well, I think since our accelerators are structured as a fund model, so it's pretty standard, like any venture capital fund, right? The three things we look at, like what most venture capitalists say, it's product, market, team, right? And then, as earlier investors, seed versus like even A or B, we do probably more emphasize the team because we expect, all the companies to pivot at least once, during the course of their life, right? But I will say on the accelerator side, we might, there might be some lesser standards at times. Like, for example, is one of my partners, he met the founder of this company or actually a nonprofit called Tree Planet, right? And it was this like young Korean that was very passionate about climate change. And he created a nonprofit that actually planted like hundreds and thousands of trees throughout the world. Right.
Nice.
So he's very passionate. He was just a very, impactful entrepreneur that we wanted to be, part of our ecosystem and family. So we brought him into the program, even though it's not like a return of investment on us. There's also like even non-tech things that interested some of my partners, and then they pushed through and we agreed. Like one was like a high-end sesame oil company called Queen's Bucket.
Nice.
Right? They did a cold press. It wasn't even like real food tech, but it tasted good, and and we liked the founder, so we got him into the program.
Why not, right? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you're doing this, not just doing the stuff you love, right? It's stuff that you think people would want to buy. It doesn't necessarily need to be tech. I think, especially one of the things about being in Silicon Valley is that that's where we go first, right? Our minds are like first with tech, but there's still so much out there outside of that world. But I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it first if there's not like a tech component to it, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's definitely biases. I would say you do naturally lean towards tech, but and then also there's this obviously mindset. Oh, is this like a 100x company, right? Right. That when you're a venture investor,
Yeah.
but the flip side is sometimes there's good businesses, and like I said on the accelerator, I think there's less pressure for us like to get that return. It could be a little more balanced.
Right. Right. Have you ever found that some of these companies that you had like amazing promise just like totally failed? And is it usually the team or the product, or what is it that usually brings them down?
I would generally say the team for either really difficult reasons, and I think I believe that it's not like a hard number, but let's say a third of startup failure has to do with the team, right? It could be team dynamics, founder conflict, but it could also be just the lack of a strong leader, right? Initially, we thought that the leader would be strong enough, right? And even early in our life, we learned not to be so enamored by technology, right? Because as a young firm, sometimes we're like, oh man, this technology is awesome, etc. And then the founding CEO was like very indecisive, back and forth on strategy, made us like pull our hair. And especially as early investors, it's not like we could force anything. We just give them advice, right?
Yeah.
And they decide to take it or leave it. And so definitely we now from our early days, from our first, I would say, year or two, we try to go a little deeper in terms of the founder and the CEO's like personality and mindset, right?
Have
It's
you ever
still
had a
hard.
situation where you've
Yeah.
had to swap out personnel, or is that just you just have you recommended that kind of thing?
I'm just trying to think. We had a situation where we had a very, I would say, unethical CEO, right?
Ooh, okay.
That we actually tied it to a funding thing, but then they actually rejected it and you know went on, right, from us, right? Because we did actually want to swap it up, but again, they have to accept it, right?
Yeah.
On another situation, we did make recommendations, or we've seen it in the later rounds, right, on the A or B. If it wasn't the right CEO, right, then hopefully that founder will agree what's best for the company, right? But there hasn't been that many of those situations. But that's actually something that's interesting because that's something that we do check on too, because
Hmm.
I would say more so than Silicon Valley in these, you know, lesser mature ecosystems, right? Like let's say South Korea, right? It's sort of like, we actually did look at uh, what Israel did also, right? Because they have a very good, strong pipeline into Silicon Valley. They might have a local founder at first, but maybe by the A or B round, they'll bring in someone from Silicon Valley to be the CEO. So that's actually one litmus test question that we have for some Korean founders, right? Especially if we find that they're some sense of, stubbornness in them, right? We'll ask, hey, if it's best for the company at the A or B round, would you consider moving to the CTO or CS role or whatever role and bring in
Right.
another CEO? If they're open to it, or, I mean, they could still be resistant, but if they say they're open to it, then I think, that's a good signal. If they're totally adamant and, in rare cases, they might get upset for us asking that, then that's a red flag for us.
Right.
So, yeah.
When would you say the ideal time to come to, like it says, it sounds like the team is super important. I mean, should an entrepreneur come to you just with an idea and then you can help them build a team around themselves, or should they come at you with a team already? Or like what's the ideal moment in time for them to approach somebody like you?
I think we deal with more complete teams because, like I mentioned before, we have the whole range, but they definitely are at least complete teams. And a fair amount of companies already raised the seed or even a small Series A round before they come to us.
Hmm.
Um, so we're not like some of these other programs. There's like Entrepreneur First in Europe that they might have a single person with an idea and help them form the team.
Right.
We're not that early in our accelerator programs. We do focus on more complete teams. With that being said, we have taken solo founders in rare occasions. We generally require obviously two co-founders, but we have taken solo founders if they already have the complete product and a strong vision. So
You are talking pre-revenue though, right? So these people, have they built, they've built something. They're in some, there's something in some state when they come to you.
no, some of them have revenue. I mean, it depends on the space, like, you know, a mature market like e-commerce, right? Like one of them, MimiBox, which is now called MBX, they already hit over $1 million in revenue when they applied to our program, right? So it depends. Some SaaS companies, they already have like, might have $500,000 to $1 million in revenue also. So it just really depends on, you know, on the vertical.
Wait, do you see anything in particular that's exciting to you that you think that companies should be looking at right now in that space? Like what should they be building?
I am the wrong partner at SparkLabs to ask that. I am. I'm like the boring guy that doesn't get excited by much, right? Like I have some partners that have like yearly themes that they'll look at,
Yeah.
right? Or they'll try to go deep in one space and they'll be like, oh, there needs to be this type of product and this type of product and this type of product. So I'm the boring guy that you're interviewing right now. I'm just like, hey, even when I meet some of our companies that we decide to invest in, the founders will go, I didn't know you were interested in us, because I have no reaction. I'm like, oh yeah, it's a pretty good company. I like it.
You're the guy who sits at the back and sort of like makes them like intimidates them by not having a reaction, right? Or like, you know, when you're negotiating for a car or a house, you know, you have to be the one who's like straight faced. No.
No, that's true. Some of them do say that they're like, you know, they thought I hated them, but it's not like on purpose. I just don't get excited naturally, right?
Yeah.
Of like on too many things. So
That's interesting. So, I mean, if you ask me, I think somebody in your position would be like super excited about all this stuff. So how does somebody with your demeanor get into it?
oh, because I mean, I think I just like helping entrepreneurs. I mean, that goes
Right.
back to like, I think the first question is, you know, what am I passionate about? I like helping other people. I like helping entrepreneurs. I like giving them advice. I like telling them all the mistakes I made and to avoid them. Right. So
So you've been teaching a lot of startups what to do next. Have any of them taught you what to do next?
Yeah, it happens all the time, right? Because it's either new industries that we're learning, right? You know, new sectors that we go into, and then even you know, sort of preconceived notions. Like example is even we'll go to like the company I mentioned, MimiBox e-commerce play, right? They initially started out selling a beauty box in South Korea, sort of like a higher end Birchbox, right? Back then. And we told them, you know, I remember telling the founder, Dino, I just said, hey, we don't like subscription e-commerce. It's actually on a downward trend in the US, right? And he, you know, he was pretty committed to his vision, but he said, hey, if I'm wrong, we'll pivot, right? But that year, he just showed us that they knew how to execute well and they knew how to pick well, right? Because at that time, I think the average churn rate of these different e-commerce boxes, at least in the US, was like 15 to 25%, right? Depending on the box. Their churn rate was like single digits.
Wow.
Right. So
How did they do that? I'd love to hear this. How does the box do that?
Well, it's like one of those, like, you read those like different HBS like case studies of like the one buyer at Macy's that drove sales for like 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And then he retires and they could never get it back, right? Like they just had the right buyers and I think pickers early on, right? To pick the right merchandise. So,
the super curated box with the perfect market.
That's right. That's right. So
so you're saying you don't see anything that looks interesting or exciting to you coming up right now that you think somebody would be interested in? Like if somebody was a budding entrepreneur and going, oh, I really want to do something, but I don't know what. Like there's nothing in particular that strikes your fancy?
No, I mean, I do have certain, I would say I do have certain themes, you know, that I'll sort of try to predict, right? And sort of peer into the future. So it's sort of, I guess, goes with one of your questions. Like I do write this annual prediction piece at VentureBeat that I've done for like 14 years. And I also like grade myself on it. And then, so I mean, like things that I look at and even predicted, I would say pre-pandemic, was this movement of, of suburban development, right?
Mhm.
Because for over a decade, people were predicting that there would be these super cities throughout the world, right? But the
Yeah.
trend even right before the pandemic was that people were moving out of these major city centers, at least in the US, and going to the suburbs or even the outskirts, right? And I think that's only accelerated, right? And so with that, I think, there's more importance in terms of certain mobility technologies, right? Pandemic definitely saved the scooter companies, right? So there'll be, I think, a
Yeah.
shift towards that, a shift towards certain types of either mass transit, and then there'll be a more importance in terms of autonomous driving when it actually becomes a reality, right? So that's something interesting to consider, right? Because there'll be not just these robo taxis or robo buses, but the services and everything else that's around that. So that's sort of a longer thing that I'm excited about.
Well, I'm wondering where the autonomous homes are going to come from, because we have these two big problems, right? We have autonomous vehicle, we have traffic issues, and we have housing issues. Like if we just
Yeah.
combine those into autonomous homes and have them drive around instead of actually staying in one spot. I mean, I wonder how far away we are from autonomous.
That's right. That's right. Or new types of homes. I mean, yeah. I mean, we actually invested in a company called Mighty Buildings
Mhm.
that
Oh yeah,
does
I know
three D
mighty
print.
buildings. They keep pestering me to put an ADU in my backyard, but my backyard is just too small.
That's right. That's right. They the 3D printed ADUs, right? Yeah, I mean, there's like obviously different plays like that that are gonna hopefully try to solve like the housing issues, right, throughout the
Yeah.
U.S. So
No,
yeah.
I love those kind of things, but the problem is that they run into the same problem. It's like zoning restrictions, right? Or
Oh
I mean,
yeah.
San Jose, they say it's going to be like 120 plus thousand to put one of these things in my backyard, and I'm like, wait a minute, it shouldn't cost that much to build one of these things. I mean, I'm sure the Mighty Buildings unit is probably a lot cheaper than that, right?
I think it is a lot cheaper than that. But you're right. Some of it is like it's interesting because some of the progress is stifled by it's not even politics at the state level. It's like it's at the very, very local level, right?
Yeah,
Because I'm in Palo Alto and I remember talking with a parent that got frustrated with some of the planning and development decisions, right? And they try to participate in this planning board, and he went to it. I mean, he's like around like my age, like 50, and he was like, it was all these 70-year-olds or plus on this like planning committee that was like blocking development of like whatever apartment buildings because
yeah,
they're all their value is in the real estate. So
yeah,
they don't want new builds, right?
yeah,
And then
yeah,
like when he was trying to like infiltrate, they started shifting the meetings. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know how factual it is, but he said they started shifting the meeting to like 2 during his work hours so he couldn't go. I thought it was hilarious
So they're
because,
retired, so they can go anytime they want, right? I mean,
well, exactly. So it's interesting. I wonder if this is true for other suburbs, right? If it is these small committees that are making such decisions and who are the stakeholders, right? It's like a micro politics issue sometimes, right?
yeah,
For the housing
yeah,
problem.
absolutely. And you know what's interesting is that I've been here for about 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And when I first moved down here, I thought this place was going to be so futuristic and everybody was going to be moving forward. There was be all this innovation, but there was just this foundational layer of, it's just so
Yeah.
static, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
think big things and we want to do big things, but it's still things are so many things are holding us back. It's so weird. I mean, the rest of the world thinks we're so innovative, but when you're actually here in the dirt, it's like, wait a minute, how come I can't get this thing moved forward?
I know, because it really is. I think it is all politics is local, right?
Yeah,
And you could have these like restrictions, whether it's implemented by the state or city government, that prevents progress, right?
yeah,
And then some of the stakeholders, they don't care. Like, the big controversy, like right by our home in Palo Alto, was there's this sidewalk that they upgraded to beautify. Like, they spent like 8 million. And it was like a
yeah,
huge controversy. I would sometimes chime in on Nextdoor and read about it, right? But like most parents were like upset. They're like, oh my gosh, you spent 8 million. Like you could have gone to the schools that we have to still fundraise for,
yeah, yeah,
right? Why are you putting it into this like beautifying a sidewalk that actually made it more narrow and supposedly made it more dangerous for bikes, not better,
yeah, yeah.
right? But then again, who was on the commission? It was he's like very old people. Now I sound like I'm like ageist or something, but it's like very old people that don't care about schools because their kids aren't in school, right?
That's right. That's right.
So,
Well, I mean, I did some work for the city of Palo Alto, and
uh-huh,
we were talking to the CIO, and we were talking about, where's your smart city going? What kind of things are going to do? Let's talk about putting in IoT devices,
uh-huh,
automate these things, and it's like we were stunned that their budgets were so minuscule, and it was so impossible
uh-huh.
to put things through. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is Palo Alto, for God's sake. This is like it should be the most innovative city in the world. You should have like sensors everywhere. You should be able to, run traffic. You should be able to do all these things. But they couldn't get anything done because the process, the local political process was so slow moving.
Oh
And
man.
you're right. It was like full of people just like that who just didn't want to see things change, it was so unfortunate.
I know, I know. Oh no, now I realize I'm gonna get bashed on next door by these like older people. They're gonna have like pictures of me. This guy, egg him.
Wait a minute, they're not all bad.
So, oh. But yeah, I mean, even like a city like Palo Alto, I'm sure there's so many like startups or even like larger companies because we've seen it in other cities around the world where they're almost willing to do things for free,
Oh yeah.
right? Or very little cost if the city and the manager, or whomever, were willing to do it,
Oh
right?
yeah. But isn't it true that it's more pervasive elsewhere, like outside of the United States? Because we have a very, very litigious culture here, right? So
Yeah.
trying to do real innovative things in certain areas, it's tough to do. But in other places in the world, probably in South Korea and other places like that, it's probably a lot easier to do that kind of business, right? To do just bust out and do some innovative things that you couldn't do before.
Yes, I mean, yeah, you're right. Depends on certain nations, but South Korea, it is a lot more top-down driven. And if you have the right sort of, president or administration or whomever, that's very influential throughout the whole country, right? I think there's too many layers. I mean, the U.S. is too big, and there's too many layers of bureaucracy, right? That has to go through. I mean, I remember even like early in my career, a while ago, I was like a low-level lobbyist for the governor in Illinois. And for a while, it was like, I don't know if it's still, I think it might still be the case where Illinois does not have a motorcycle helmet law.
What? Really?
Yeah, at
No
that
way.
time, they blocked it because, and that's why Illinois did not get federal highway money. And they had to have all the tolls and everything because they had a national motorcycle law, helmet law, but it was tied to highway development money or,
Right.
road improvement, etc. And it was a grassroots motorcycle club that blocked it every year. And that was interesting too, because they didn't
Wow.
have money, but they
Mhm.
had mass volunteers that every election cycle would volunteer for all these politicians' campaigns. So that's
Right.
when I learned, like early in my career, sometimes it's not about money, it's about influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Well,
and
that's
then
what it is.
there's,
If you think about it, I mean, all of this technology, all this amazing stuff that we could be doing, it's all just people holding it back, right? I mean, I fully believe that we have the technology to do almost anything. If we could
yeah.
just get humans to to admit that it should be done, right?
Well, yeah, that's the same thing. Like even with autonomous driving, like let's
Yeah.
say, whatever estimate, let's say if it's like really like 5 years out where they solve like and really get to like level 5, right? Autonomous driving. But I think it will be the states that block it anyways. So it'll be a
Yeah.
longer horizon to be
Yeah.
fully implemented because it is going to be these state legislators that are typically 70 plus or who knows, like very old, that's fearful of new technology and what it could do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you think about it, I mean, even the Segway was banned in San Francisco when it first came out, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, but I mean, but again, it sort of comes back to, I mean, I believe everyone's, outside of the US, a lot of people just don't understand America and how we work. It's like we're 50 little countries. So what happens in country A doesn't necessarily happen in country B. So, but the thing is that, where do you find California really should be the state that where this stuff is allowed to move forward, but we still see it, lagging behind.
Yeah, I think it's just because there's so many layers of bureaucracy and even when I was early in my career in the political scene, there's so many people that you have to do favors for, right?
Right.
In politics, they say in social media or whatever, it's attention economy. In politics, it's definitely a favor economy, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes it's not even just about money, right? It's about who you owe, or who's the quote unquote forefather that you owe for you
Right.
getting into that position. So yeah, so
So what
much
do you think about,
inefficiency.
so what do you think about the things like what Uber did, where they just sort of barreled into a market and then, damn the torpedoes, and then in some places they got banned and then they're back again. You think that's a good way to innovate? Like, just let's launch the damn thing, despite whatever the rules and regs are?
I'm personally not like that. Maybe that won't make me a successful entrepreneur like Travis, right? I think I'm a little more Boy Scoutish, where you try to play by the rules and be the sort of good actor, within that market. And that's how I probably advise, um, our founders too. But I mean, some people are comfortable with that, and backing entrepreneurs like that. Some people are not. I mean, it depends, right? And I'm sure the people that backed Travis, they didn't know exactly how he would operate, right? So, right.
Exactly. So when have you ever had like any of these startup founders come to you and you're like the idea is just like so amazingly mind blowing, and you think this has got to be a success, and then it just doesn't go anywhere? Has that happened to you?
Like I said, I don't get that excited, but
Well,
no,
your
no,
partners, let's say your partners get super excited, going, "This is mind blowing! It's amazing," and then it just doesn't go anywhere. Well,
yeah, that's happened several times, right? And
yeah.
you know, I'm actually sometimes a voice of dissent, but there are times where I not like go, oh, this is mind blowing, but I go, oh, I really like this company, I like the product, like let's back them, right? But it just goes sideways for whatever reason.
Hmm.
Typically it's either they're too early, right, or lack of leadership, or some other things, right, that happen, right? Or they underestimate how much funding they need, right? An
Right.
example is early on we were very active in consumer IoT devices. So we're one of
Hmm.
the few investors that were pretty active in the hardware space. And all these hardware plays, they raised anywhere from like a 2 to 4 million seed. But what we found was that all of them eventually needed additional capital, no matter what, even if they had like just-in-time manufacturing, close relationships on the supply chain, etc.
Yeah.
There's always something that happened, even like a little like nut or something that was, broken, or that
Yeah.
they had to like send back X amount of units, and they lost like 200,000 to 1 million in
Yeah.
capital,
Wow.
right? So that's something that we learned, early on, and definitely in the hardware space, there was, you know, underestimation of the mistakes that would happen. So
Right. But that didn't make you shy away from getting into hardware, though, right? If it was an interesting play, you still went into it.
yeah, we still went into it, and then we would coach them, on the things that we saw before, right?
Mhm.
And just to be, what to be aware of if they have to raise more capital, or definitely, get more debt financing, right, when they could. So
Yeah. So I think what you said a minute ago was really sort of triggering to me, is like timing, right? I think timing is like the most important thing, because you could have the exact same thing, 5 years ago doesn't fly, and today it's great. I mean, is there any way to figure out? Is there any way to do a better job of predicting timing for a product?
I think that's where, like, some of it is probably on the investor, right? To sort of know that market that the entrepreneur is targeting, and then agree that, this is the right timing. And obviously,
Yeah.
you know, at least half or less of it is the luck part too, right? That it
Yeah.
is the right timing and it'll succeed, right? But yeah, it's something we do have the conviction that, hey, this is the perfect time for this product, right? And this is the right team to execute. So let's back them, right? So
Mhm.
we definitely had those conversations before. There are times where we feel like, oh, this is too early, right? It's, maybe 2, 3 years down the road or something, or there's other like greater market factors, right? So
Hello, you still there?
yeah, I'm still there. Yeah. Hello.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that. What was I going to say? Is, oh, it was like timing. Oh yeah. So Some people say that it's definitely the product itself that is the failure. Is like you just didn't hit product market fit. But is that almost always the case, that you just like it's the product that's the problem, or that's the number one reason why these things fail?
I mean, the product itself, I think, really is more on the team, right? Unless it's like a exceptional like product that is category changing, like, creates new headwinds, etc. Right?
Hmm.
I think it really is the team, because at least at our stage, at the seed stage, you know, there will be adjustments to the model or the product. So it's really upon, that team to make the right adjustments, right? And tweak it. So I would put it more on the team at that stage. I think if it's a later, like the A and B round, and then something goes sideways, right? Then it's more on, oh, this, it wasn't the right product at that time.
Right.
So
So one of the other things I was thinking about is that how much of this has to do with sort of like the audience that the founders have. So, because if you think about it, if you build traction, if the founder themselves are, they have a lot of followers, or people know them, or they're well known, what they're going to do is probably was going to be more successful than founders who are basically unknown. I mean, does that make any difference in the success of a startup?
I think it depends on what they're building, right?
Hmm.
I mean, there's always, depending, I'm just trying to think of, there's founders that obviously were very good at evangelizing, and they needed to, right? If you look at like Drew Houston, right, at Dropbox, right? He
Right.
evangelized everywhere, right? He spoke at like everything, I think, right? Just to tell people about the product, getting used. And I think that's a very good strategy for them that worked. And then there's a flip side of, some products that really need the attention of the CEO, right?
Right.
That they have to drill down on the product, or I guess the sales side, right? Because
Hmm.
most times CEOs can't do both, right? It's either, product or sales, or whatnot. So they, you know, if someone is doing too much of the evangelism, but they should be really focused on the product, there are times where, we would have a talk with them and say, hey, I think you're speaking at too many events, right? It's not really core to your business. Like, we'd rather have
Right.
you, laser focused, right?
Right. They're
On
more
develop. Yeah.
basking in the limelight and growing their audience as opposed to driving the company forward.
Yeah, yeah. Unless it is, obviously, beneficial for their company, right? Then we would, have a check with the entrepreneur. So
So let's talk, it's the foresight time. So let's talk about 2031. Where do you think things are going to be in 10 years?
10 years. So I would say, going to the whole like suburban sprawl, right? 10 years from now, right?
Okay.
Um, I would say the population is more distributed, right? It isn't these city centers, at least in the US. I think
Hmm.
Asia will be different. I think will still continue to trend to be these mega cities,
Right.
right? But in the US, I think it'll be more suburban sprawl. At that time, maybe finally in 10 years, there'll be the first robo taxis deployed, right? Or
You think it'll take 10
autonomous
years?
vehicles.
You
Huh?
think it'll take 10 years for autonomous vehicles to be deployed? Really?
I think mass transit will come first, right? Like autonomous buses and other things. I think at least 5 years out for regular cars, just because, like I said, the technology might be there, but I think it'll be the regulation that slows it down.
Hmm.
And then it'll be interesting to see like how, um, I mean, even just the world responds to things such as like cryptocurrency, right? And how sort of corporates and nations evolve, right, side by side with each other, right? So, I mean, my thesis on whole one, I do believe that majority of the top 30 OECD nations are going to launch their own cryptocurrency, right? And once that occurs, you won't see this feeding frenzy of like 100 altcoins currently, right? I
Right.
think it'll be narrowed down to probably the top 10 or 20 that'll be
Hmm.
viable, right? And even though that these national crypto cyber currencies go against the mantra of, crypto, right? Because it'll be for the nations, tracking everything of its citizens, right? But people will still use it, right? And they've already obviously have done testing in China. There'll be Russia, but I think other major nations will follow after that. So I think it'll change the landscape there, right? So that'll be sort of interesting to see. And then even I don't know, sort of like these. I did predict that there'll be sort of these tribes surrounding more of the larger tech companies, right? So sort of this loyalty to nations will be a little skewed, right? It might be tribes around like Facebook or Twitter or Clubhouse or whatnot, right? So that'll be sort of interesting to see, right?
Well, William Gibson's predicted that, very early on. He's like, you're going to be like a citizen of Braun or a citizen of Google or a citizen of these companies. So you think nationalism will still be around because you're talking about, crypto, country-based crypto, but there's still going to be global. There's going to be global crypto and all that stuff. I think there's going to be like tons and tons of currencies, but we won't be able to keep track of it all.
Yeah, I think there'll be less currencies. That's my thesis, right?
Okay.
That all these altcoins will go away. It'll be more national currencies, and then maybe even currencies around certain big tech, right? Right, because everyone was afraid when Facebook was going to launch Libra and their own currency.
Oh, it freaked everybody out. I couldn't believe how much it freaked everybody out. I thought, God.
Yeah, it freaked everyone out. Yeah, of course, because it sort of it weakens their sovereignty, right? So
exactly
that, and then even what Twitter did, right, with Trump, right? Basically, you even had some progressive, very progressive minds, I would say, in Silicon Valley, saying, "Oh, this is not a good thing to do," right? You're basically silencing, a head of a major nation.
Yeah.
Right. And that's when Germany and other, world leaders chimed in and said, this is not a good thing. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all evolves. Oh, you were frozen. Sorry. Hello. How it all evolves, especially tied into currencies too. When some of these companies do launch their own currencies, right? Because you'll see, Facebook, I'm sure eventually will within the next few years, right? Along with some of the big tech players in Asia too. So
it'll be interesting. Like all the Facebook employees will be paid in Facebook coin or what Libra. They changed the name of Libra to something else, didn't they?
Yeah, they changed it to something else. I forgot.
Yeah. So everybody who works at Facebook will be paid in Libra or whatever it is, and then they're going to have to go exchange it to buy things from Google Store or whatever.
Right.
It's going to be insane. I mean, I love all this stuff. It's so cool, and I just wish it would just move faster. That's the thing. It's like it always seems to be get bogged down in all these systems that we already have in place, and none of it's getting disruptive. Like the educational system is the same as it was. The housing crisis is the same as it was. All of these institutions that we've had for 100 years or more are still the same as they always were. And it's like I can't wait to see them being disrupted by something, but we still seem to keep dragging them back down again.
I mean, it has to be disrupted, even like the inefficiencies of that education system, right? Like I forget the exact number, but what, like 50-55% of the California budget goes to education, but it's still like bottom percentile of the US.
Oh yeah, it's insane. It's insane.
I mean, because I worked at the state level, there's so many layers of bureaucracy. So that money, goes to, some side committee here, some side committee there. It eventually doesn't reach the kids, right? It's like the famous study of Washington, D.C. schools, what was it, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
They were the highest per capita spend on a student, but they're bottom in the U.S., right? Right? Because there's so many layers.
Politics is the real enemy of progress, right?
Maybe, right? Right? So it'll be interesting because I think education does need to be disrupted, and it has to be more efficient, right? Even I have 12-year-old twin girls, and one of them started doing Duolingo and is already at basic Japanese in 3 months because she spent 2 hours on it every day.
Yeah.
Right. It's amazing what they could do on their own, with their own initiative nowadays. Right.
Yeah.
And so,
well, I mean, look at the tech field. I mean, you've got coding boot camps, you've got the no code movement. I mean, you've got so much going on in that space that just busting up, education in the tech space. And then who knows how this is going to affect other areas as well. It's just crazy.
Yeah. And it's interesting because since you brought that up, like I think I just saw a tweet by Paul Graham where he said like I think one of his kids was doing a coding, one of the coding sites, but the school blocked it.
Seriously?
Yeah, I mean, you should look at the thread. Like I didn't read everything. I was just sort of skimming, but it was interesting that the school blocked it, and someone, because I think they were fearful, or I think the response was, they didn't want them to spend time outside of their assignments.
Oh man.
Right, but
he was learning to code.
Right. Right. So it's interesting when technology does create the efficiencies, but the established institutions, like how are they going to respond? Right? Yeah. Are they going to block it? Is going to be this like committee that doesn't want certain things or new housing, right, to alleviate the housing pressure in the Bay Area or wherever, right? And then even when like new technology comes, I mean, I am a little concerned at how we will use it. So let's say even like AI, as AI advances, it improves our decision making. But I can see, let's say, politicians or even like corporates, right? Corporates, like for decades, they were using McKinsey and Bain to make excuses to make firing decisions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And with AI, what if they start making excuses and punting it to AI? Right? Say, oh yeah, that machine made the decision, right? Oh, I had to fire X amount of people. Oh, I had to, worst case scenario, I had to fire these missiles here.
Yeah, exactly. It's the AI making the decision, not me, right? They're going to push off the responsibility.
Yeah, so that's a dangerous thing because most people are, I would say, I mean, I don't know how to say it in a better way, but they're wimps because they don't want to take the responsibility or the heat for hard decisions. Right?
Exactly.
There's some smaller group of leaders that will take the heat, are willing to, right? But I think most people don't want that, and they'll just punt it.
Yeah, yeah, and then they'll take their decisions and they'll encode it into the AI, and then have the AI do the firing and say, "See, the AI fired you."
That's right.
It's like when Amazon was using AI to hire people or to filter resumes, and it was like incredibly biased, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then they went in. And then they went and said, okay, we got to reprogram this to be less biased. And then it was still more biased. And it's like, wait a minute. And then they trashed it. It's like, wait a second. It's like, who's doing the programming? That's what people say to me. Oh, what about bias in AI? Well, who's doing the programming, right? I mean, you got to just go back to that and say, where's the human in the equation? And you end up finding blame.
Exactly. Right. Where's the data from? Who sets up the code? So.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been great. Is there if somebody wants to get in touch with you, just hit up your website, or what's the best way?
Yeah, they could email me directly. It's Bernard@sparklabsglobal.com.
So, very cool.
Appreciate your time, Chris.
It sounds like you're open to talking to new entrepreneurs or startup founders who are interested in connecting with you.
Yep. Yeah, they could email me and connect. So.
Very cool. Well, I'll put all your contact information in the show notes, and we can go from there. So thank you, sir. It was a great conversation. Good talking with you.
Okay, great. It was fun. Thanks.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.